Once upon a time, in the mighty kingdom of Agumba, there lived a prince named Obika. He was handsome, strong, and destined to be king. His father, King Azuto, ruled with wisdom, and his mother, Queen Adana, was kind-hearted. The people of Agumba loved their royal family, except for one problem. Obika was greedy. No matter how much he had, he always wanted more. The palace had golden plates, yet he took treasures from the royal treasury. His mother prepared the finest meals, yet he stole food from the market. He even forced villagers to pay more taxes, making them struggle, just so he could buy more silk, more jewels, more land. His father warned him, "A greedy king brings ruin to his people." But Obika only laughed. "What is the point of being a prince if I cannot have everything?" One fateful day, an old beggar arrived at the palace gates. He was frail and starving, leaning on a wooden staff. "Please, my prince," the beggar pleaded. "Just a little food." Obika laughed cruelly and threw dirt at him. The beggar looked up, his eyes sharp as fire. "A greedy man is never full, just like an empty pot that swallows the ocean and still asks for rain." That night, something terrible happened. That night, a strange wind howled through the palace. The air felt heavy, as if the gods themselves were watching. Obika lay on his golden bed, rubbing his full stomach, satisfied after feasting on the best meats and wines. But as he closed his eyes, a deep hunger suddenly clawed at his belly. He sat up in confusion. How could he be hungry again? He had just eaten a grand feast. Ignoring it, he tried to sleep, but the hunger only grew stronger, painful, unbearable. By morning, his stomach was swollen like a drum. He rushed to the royal kitchen and devoured an entire pot of yam porridge, but his hunger only grew worse. He ate all the bread, all the roasted meat, all the fruits in the palace, but his stomach kept expanding. The palace servants whispered in fear. The queen begged him to stop, but he couldn't. When his father, King Azuto, arrived, his eyes widened in horror. What madness is this? But before Obika could answer, his hands trembled, his legs weakened, and his stomach rumbled like thunder. Something terrible was happening. The royal physicians were summoned, but none had seen a sickness like this. Obika groaned in pain, his swollen stomach shaking like a pot of boiling water. King Azuto paced in distress. "This is no ordinary illness," he muttered. "This is a curse." But Obika refused to believe it. He sent the royal guards to the marketplace, demanding more food, more livestock, more grains. The villagers wailed their prince was eating everything, yet his stomach only grew bigger. Servants laid before him a feast fit for 10 kings, and still he devoured it all in minutes. His hands moved like a wild beast's, stuffing food into his mouth without control. The queen wept. "Obika, my son, stop! You will destroy yourself." But the prince couldn't stop. He had never felt hunger like this. It was a bottomless pit, an endless craving. Then the ground beneath him trembled. His skin darkened, his voice deepened, his teeth grew sharp like a beast's fangs. The villagers gasped in horror. Their prince was turning into a monster. Obika staggered back, clutching his enormous belly. His skin turned rough like tree bark, his nails grew into claws, and his voice became a deep, monstrous growl. The villagers screamed. The palace guard stepped back in fear. King Azuto's face darkened. "The gods have cursed you, Obika," he declared. "Your greed has turned you into a beast." But Obika refused to listen. "I am not cursed. I just need more food," he roared. He stormed out of the palace, his monstrous feet shaking the ground. He ran to the marketplace and devoured entire baskets of food yams, bananas, roasted meat, anything he could grab. But his hunger only worsened. His body grew even larger, his face unrecognizable. His once handsome features were now hideous, his hands like a wild animal's. Then a terrible voice echoed in the air. "A greedy man is never full, just like an empty pot that swallows the ocean and still asks for rain." The villagers froze. The words of the old beggar had come true. Obika had become a creature of endless hunger. The king's greedy son, a kingdom in fear. The people of Agumba watched in horror as their prince's strong and proud had become a monstrous beast. His swollen belly dragged against the ground, his arms and legs thick like tree trunks, his once beautiful face distorted beyond recognition. But the worst part? His hunger never stopped. He stormed through the village, grabbing whatever he could find: sacks of rice, roasted fish, even raw yams. He shoved them into his mouth, but nothing satisfied him. The more he ate, the hungrier he became. The villagers cried out to the king, "Save us, your majesty! Obika will eat the whole kingdom." King Izuto stood on the palace balcony, watching his son consume everything in sight. His heart was heavy with sorrow. "This is not my son anymore," the king whispered. "This is a punishment from the gods." Obika turned to the palace, his monstrous eyes glowing. "Father," he growled, his voice deep and terrifying, "I need more food." Then, with a mighty roar, he charged toward the palace gates. The ground shook as Obika's monstrous feet pounded toward the palace. His swollen belly dragged behind him, his claws tore into the earth, and his eyes burned with endless hunger. The palace guards raised their spears. "Stop, Prince Obika," they shouted. But Obika was no longer a prince. With one mighty swing of his arm, he sent the guards flying like dry leaves. The palace gates cracked and shattered under his weight. Queen Adana fell to her knees, sobbing, "My son, stop this madness." But Obika could not hear her. His hunger was too powerful, too uncontrollable. King Izuto stepped forward, his voice firm. "Obika, if you do not stop, the gods will destroy you." But Obika only roared. His monstrous hands grasped the golden palace doors, tearing them apart. The kingdom of Agumba was on the verge of ruin, and Obika was unstoppable. Obika stormed into the palace, knocking over golden statues and royal furniture. His monstrous hands grabbed everything in sight: fruits, meats, even bags of flour, shoving them into his mouth. But still, his hunger grew. The palace trembled as King Izuto rose from his throne, his face filled with sorrow. "Obika," he said, his voice echoing through the great hall. "You were born to be a king, but you have become a curse upon this land. If you do not stop, the gods themselves will put an end to you." Obika's glowing eyes flickered. For a moment, it seemed like he recognized his father. But then, his hunger roared louder than his reason. "I cannot stop," he growled. "I need more, more, more." Then, he turned toward the royal treasury, the last place in the kingdom, filled with riches, food. The king's wise elders gathered in the palace hall, whispering in fear. "This is not just greed," one elder said. "This is a curse from the gods." King Izuto clenched his fists. "Then we must break the curse, before it is too late." But outside, Obika's body shuddered. His skin grew darker, his teeth sharper, his voice deeper. His hunger was turning him into something far worse. Queen Adana ran to the treasury, her heart breaking at the sight of her son, a beast of greed, lost to his endless hunger. "Obika, my son," she sobbed, "please stop this madness. The gods will destroy you." Obika's glowing eyes flickered for a moment. His mother's voice, it was the only thing that still felt familiar. Then, his stomach rumbled like thunder. "No," he growled. "I must eat. I must have more." His hands tore through the last of the food supplies. The kingdom of Agumba had nothing left, and Obika's hunger was still not satisfied. Chapter 10. The Prophecy Revealed. That night, as the kingdom mourned their lost prince, a mystical wind blew through the palace. An old priestess, the oldest in Agumba, stepped forward. Her eyes were clouded with age, but her voice was strong. "I have seen this before," she said. "A man who lets greed control him will never be satisfied until he consumes himself." The room fell silent. King Izuto's face paled. "You mean Obika will never stop?" The priestess nodded. "His hunger will grow until there is nothing left, until he devours his own soul." A terrible realization struck the king. There was only one way to stop Obika now, and it would come at a great cost. King Izuto gathered his strongest warriors. If Obika could not be saved, then he had to be stopped. "We must strike before his hunger consumes the world," the king declared. But Queen Adana fell to her knees. "No, there must be another way." The warriors hesitated. Could they really raise their spears against the Prince of Agumba? Meanwhile, Obika stood at the palace gates, his monstrous body shaking. His belly was now so large it dragged against the ground. His teeth were sharp as daggers. His hunger was no longer just for food. Now, he craved something greater, something terrible. The kingdom awoke to screams. Obika had turned on his own people. No longer satisfied with food, he devoured livestock, then crops, then even trees. His hunger grew beyond human understanding. The warriors rushed to stop him, but Obika swiped his claws, sending them crashing to the ground. King Izuto's heart ached. This was no longer his son. This was a demon of greed. The gods were watching, and soon they would decide Agumba's fate. As the sky darkened, thunder rumbled over the land. The gods had seen enough. A deep, booming voice filled the air. Obika, son of Agumba, your greed has cursed the land. You have taken without giving, consumed without sharing. Now your fate is sealed. Obika froze. For the first time, fear entered his glowing eyes. No, he growled. I only wanted more. Just a little more. But the gods were not listening. A mystical wind howled through the kingdom, and the ground began to shake. Something terrible was coming. Obika clutched his belly, roaring in agony. His body swelled, twisted, and cracked. His skin hardened like stone. His fingers stretched into jagged claws. The people of Agumba watched in horror. Their prince was no longer human. Obika's form rose higher, larger, monstrous. His swollen belly grew into an endless pit, his mouth wide enough to swallow a house. He had become the spirit of eternal hunger, and now there was only one thing left to consume.